Okay. Um, this is a painting. So what is Joan Mitchell doing with warm and cool color here? So if we start to identify the warms and cools, how is she using the warms and how is she using the cool colors in this painting?
There's a lot more cool color on the canvas. Or, yeah, the canvas. Um, and the warm is kind of gathered in like um, the right hand corner and scattered a little bit at the bottom, or like, yeah, the bottom in a few places, but it's mostly cool colors.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I guess it is mostly cool colors. So violets, blues, cool greens. Um, you know, these are very dark violets. What do you mean? I actually don't see warm colors in the lower right corner. You mean down here?
No, so on the left, there's like cool, not cool, warm colors, like a little bit coming
Yeah,
in a
this,
diagonal, but
yeah,
on
this,
the right, top, there's
right.
a gathering of warm colors.
Yeah, there's a kind of band of warm colors running through the painting that swings. It almost takes on a kind of hammock shape. She's also balancing the warms, right? So the warms are spread out throughout the painting to create a kind of balance. And that play, this kind of play of warm and cool that we're seeing in this painting is a more typical approach. So this is a Kerry James Marshall painting where he's balancing the warm colors in the painting against the cools. You know, overall, I would say this is a cool painting. Here again, a painter balancing warm and cools. This is a painting by Pierre Bonnard. Um, so seeing the interior as essentially warm, the exterior as cool, and then any place that the light from the exterior is touching the interior, it picks up the warmth from the exterior. So Bonnard here is using warm and cool to play with light. So he's identifying the light in this painting as being cool. And we read these shadows here as relatively warm, or we read the warms as shadow areas because they're painted in contrast to the cools. I'll skip a few of these. So these two paintings, on the left is a painting by an artist named Gwen John, and on the right is an artist named Anna Acher. And they were both artists in the early 20th century. Um, and so in these paintings, the artists are very aware of the color temperature of light. And the temperature of light is intimately related to the temperature, to color temperature. And in fact, all light has a specific temperature. In fact, it's calibrated on a scale from warm to cool. And I don't know if anyone's ever noticed this, but when you buy light bulbs nowadays, if you look on the back of the box, they'll tell you where the light is on the spectrum from warm light to cool light. So in these paintings, so look really carefully at these paintings. So don't look at local color. In other words, don't look at, for example, the local color of the wallpaper. The wallpaper in this painting is blue. So that's, in terms of its local color, in terms of its color without regard to the temperature of light, that color is cool. In this painting, the wallpaper is warm. The local color of the wallpaper is warm, right? It's yellow wallpaper. And we would all say that that's a warm color. So if we were to place these on a side of the color wheel, the color of the wallpaper here, the wallpaper in the Gwen John painting would be yellow and warm. The wallpaper in the Anna Acha painting would be blue or kind of violet blue and cool. But look really carefully at the light. Like, where's the light coming into the room in these two paintings? Which painting has the warm light and which painting has the cool light? Anyone want to identify any of either of those? Okay, so Tommy in the chat says that the left has warm. The left has the warm light. So what do other people think?
I would say the right because the light has like a yellow tint to it.
And where do you see the yellow tint?
Um, I guess when it hits the globe, is that what it is, or the figure?
Yeah, the head of the young girl. Yeah, so there's a girl standing here. In case that's not clear, maybe it's not totally clear, but there's a young girl standing here, and we see her blonde hair. And then would you also say, Kayla, that the color of the light here is warm?
Yeah, I think it still has that yellow tint to it.
Yeah, so I think that's right. So also, what kind of light is it that we're looking at? Are we looking at direct sunlight streaming into a room, or are we looking at indirect sunlight? In other words, sunlight that's coming from the side of a building that's not directly facing the sun. Like, what kind of light does this look like? Does this look like direct sunlight or indirect light? What do you think, Kayla?
Oh, sorry, I didn't know you were talking to me.
No, it's okay.
um,
I mean, I wasn't necessarily, but
um, uh, to be honest, I'm not really sure. If I was to take a guess, I would say direct because it seems like it's pretty strong.
yeah, it's direct sunlight, right? When direct sunlight comes into a room, we see sharp sharp divisions between the parts of the interior that are being directly hit by the sunlight, and then a sharp division between other areas of the room. So we see that kind of sharpness. Where in this painting, we're getting indirect light, right? So we're not getting direct sunlight. In other words, this window is not looking out to part of the cityscape where we could directly see the sun. So the sun would be behind us, like it would be on the other side of the building. So the light coming in here is indirect. So actually what's happening is the light that's coming into this room is light that is entirely bounced light. In other words, it's light that's hitting other things and then reflecting back into the room. And what's the largest, can anyone think about what would be the largest thing in an exterior that sunlight would be bouncing off of? Like if we're not getting direct light in a room, then we're getting light from the sun that bounces off other objects and then reflects back into the room. And what's the biggest area, reflective area, out in any landscape? What would the light be bouncing off of?
Water.
Possibly, that could be, which would do what to the light?
It would kind of like muddle it.
It would cool it down, because when light reflects off of objects, it picks up some of the color it's reflecting off of. So it would cool it down. It would give it a kind of green-blue tint to it. But water is actually less likely than you might think. what's the light going to be primarily bouncing off of? This is it's a harder question than maybe it sounds, because we wouldn't think of this thing as necessarily reflective. What happens is the sunlight bounces off the blue of the sky. So it bounces off the atmosphere, and it picks up some of the blue of the sky or some of the gray of the sky, depending on the color of the sky. And so indirect light is always a kind of gray-blue. So this light's actually an indirect light. This is actually a cool blue light. So if you compare the temperature, and it's subtle, but you can still see it. If you compare the temperature of the light hitting this white surface here to the temperature of this light, this is a cool light and this is a warm light. And while this is a warm local color, we're seeing it in a relatively cool way because of the color of the light. So we not only want to think about color as local color, temperature as local color. So in other words, the warm yellow of this wallpaper or the cool blue of this wallpaper. That's one way to think about color temperature. But another important thing for us is to think about the color of the light. So here a cool light and here a warm light. So most paintings that we see, certainly traditional paintings, so it's not true in more recent paintings, but most paintings we see have a cool light. So this is a cool light source. A cool light source. So we don't want to be confused by the temperature, the local temperature of the object. We only want to be thinking about the temperature of the light. That's something we'll be thinking about going forward, both the color temperature, the local temperature, but also the temperature of the light. So we're going to be working with white and black, and then we're going to be adding an earth red, a red called transparent red oxide. And often this kind of painting exercise we're doing is called a warm cool painting. And sometimes, I just think it's worth pointing out, paintings have been done and they are almost entirely warm cool paintings. So for example, this painting by Rembrandt, which is in New York, it's at the Met. This is a painting that's almost entirely a warm cool painting. In other words, it's almost entirely done with the colors we're going to be using today, which are white, black, and earth red. So the colors in the head would have been made with variations of white, black, and red. Most of the colors in the painting, there may be some traces of yellow in the gold parts of the costumes. And then this is a painting that's obviously not entirely done with white, black, and red. Although parts of this painting are incredibly simple, like all of the black clothing is done purely with black and white. And I only point that out because often you'll hear in beginning painting classes that you should never use black, that you should never use black that comes out of the tube. But I completely disagree with that. I think black out of the tube is a very useful color. And it's often used to great effect in many, many paintings. But one part of this painting, so specifically the heads, or the heads of both figures, are done entirely with white, black, and earth red. So a similar combination to what we're using. So all of these variations of flesh tones, from the very lightest, which would be a mixture of white and red, a pure white and red. The ruddy parts of the cheeks have a little bit more red in them. And then the shadows are done with mixing various amounts of black into that mixture. The kind of bluish gray parts of the flesh are done with extra black in the mixture. So an incredibly rich and varied painting can be achieved using just the warm, cool mixture we're going to be using. So it's something to try to achieve as rich a range, see if you can achieve as rich a range of color as possible in using the very simple colors we're going to be dealing with today. Okay, all right, so let's escape this. Sorry, I don't check, I do not check the chat very often. It's better to just speak up. The chat distracts me. I don't know if anyone else feels that way. I feel like I'm trying to do too many things at once. Okay, so I have my still life set up, and I sent everybody sorry, I sent everybody the reference photo, so please make use of that. I have my still life set up here, which I'll be working from. Again, please make use of the reference photo so you know what I'm working with, okay? Okay, so as I said, we're going to be using the colors we've been using so far this semester. So we're going to be using white. And black. And then we're going to add to that transparent red oxide. So that's a color that everybody should have, and it's a transparent color, and when it comes right out of the tube, it's relatively, it's dark. But if we mix just a little bit of white with that, you can see how that's a relatively warm color. And so our distinctions between warm and cool today are not going to be as pronounced as they will be when we get into a full palette. So we're going to be using these relatively subtle distinctions between warm and cool. So distinction between the transparent red oxide and black will be our cool color. So if people make use of the reference I sent, people should be able to see that the orange we're obviously going to be identifying as warm. And the orange is sitting on a cool, it's actually a bluish surface. And then we have the warm background. The warm background of the box. And I know people are probably sick of painting fruit by now. But in so many ways, it's the most useful for us at this stage. It's much harder to control things like color and temperature, planar structure, if we're just choosing random objects. So I hope people can bear with this a bit more. So I'm just blocking out the orange using the same technique that we've talked about all semester. I won't go into the details of drawing as we talked about it. So I'll try to do this quickly. Now I noticed when I sent the photo to people that the photograph did not adequately pick up some of the warmth of this setup. So, for example, the cast shadow that I'm drawing right now is actually quite warm. So, and hopefully people understand that's the case because the cast shadow is not getting direct light, but it's picking up light from primarily light bouncing off the warm colors of the box. I'll talk about the warmth of the cast, the warmth of the shadow in a minute. Just refine this a little bit. So I want to emphasize something today. So we're going to be dealing with color because we've introduced the color to our black and white. And we're going to be dealing with color in the sense that we're going to be looking for variations of warm and cool. But I want to emphasize that with this palette, and in a way this is an obvious statement, we're not going to be able to match the colors we're looking at, right? We're only going to be able to indicate distinctions between warms and cools. So don't forget that. We can't match the colors. And again, that sounds maybe like it's an obvious statement, but I think people get thrown when they're confronted with how obviously different the colors can look. And you sort of forget that we're not trying to match colors, we're just trying to observe distinctions between warm and cool. So looking at the still life, if people have the reference, so we can see, I think, pretty clearly that the surface of the table is a cool color. Right? So the surface of the table is...
Professor?
I'm sorry?
Somebody got locked out.
Someone got locked out? Okay. Kamaya, did you get back in? Okay, so thinking as much about value as we've been doing all semester. And I want people to remember that. So we're moving on to warm and cool. We're dealing with color. But that doesn't mean you let go of what we've been dealing with so far. So we spent a lot of time working with value, and you want to be just as careful about finding convincing value relationships in this painting as you have been in every other painting. So we studied value and we studied planar structure. And you want to keep looking for those elements as well. We're not leaving them behind. We're simply incorporating an observation of warms and cools into what we've already done. So I'm just going to be blocking out very broadly. Just like we've done all semester, the big masses of warm and cool colors. And as always, this is a kind of a first stab at the value of the color. I should say value and temperature. But I think this value is going to be a pretty good one for what I need the painting to do. And I talked to people a little bit about this. When putting paint down on the canvas, try to avoid any kind of regular mechanical approach to putting down the paint. Try to move your brush around in an active way so that you want to avoid this kind of house painting-like stroke. You want to try to move the paint around so that the paint, even if eventually we knit this all together, so that the paint has a kind of vitality and activity to it. You never want the paint to have the mechanical look of, again, house painting or some kind of product that's been painted in an absolutely smooth way. Certainly, I don't mean to say that you can't eventually make the painting so that you've convincingly knit together all of the tones so that you have a consistent and smooth progression, but you want to build up to that slowly. Okay, so I have my colors a bit dark, so I'm going to go into this with my white. And I'm going to lighten it a little bit, although I'm only going to lighten it in certain areas. So again, if you look at your reference image, you'll notice that the surface of the table is a little bit brighter in front, because that's closer to the light source. And as the object, or as the surface of the table moves back away from the light, it gets darker. And I'm going to just indicate that by bringing a little bit more paint. And then I'll let that paint sort of feather it into the darker paint in the background. I want to point out something that sort of defies the rules of light and the rules of physics in a way, but is a common painting device. So the shadow part of the orange right here is very dark, and that makes the tabletop behind the orange appear light. And it's often a good idea to slightly lighten the area that in paintings that border shadows. sort of pull out the intensity of the dark shadow now. So just lighten that area a little bit as a way of setting up those values I'm going to put down in the background. So now the value of the back wall of the box is clearly much warmer than the value of the tabletop. And it is about the same value, but it's actually a little bit lighter than the darkest part of the tabletop. Where the two of them meet. So that's white and that's just white and red, but just white and transparent red oxide. So what do you think we can make that color somehow more indicative of the color of the box? How does that seem given our color limitations on this palette? Does that seem like a good temperature? Does that seem too warm? Does it seem too cool? What do people think?
Finalmente, Carol. Siempre con cosas, Carolina, cuando yo la necesito tanto.
What do people think of that value, of that temperature?
Ayer confirmamos contrato, no ha habido un problema.
Is someone talking? I think someone's talking, but I can't hear.
Para estar acá y quieren cobrar $100 y su papá está berraco y ahora ya hay un lío ahí. Se queda por día y él quiere solamente pagar 1.300 lo que pagaba de móvil.
I think that the the orange seems like much brighter than the background, the box in the back. So I guess it's hard to tell without the orange being filled in, but yeah.
Well, that's a really good point. So that for you, the orange is much brighter than the background, which is certainly true. And so does that make you think that the background right now is too warm?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's accurate. I think that given what the colors we have, we're going to need to cool that background down a little bit. And that's, again, a really good observation. We're going to need to do that because if we're going to be able to suggest the intensity of the warmth of the orange, we're going to need to cool down the background. That's probably just too cool a color, period. I mean, too warm a color, period. So we want to cool that down. So I'm adding some black to it. Black is our cool color. And add black to it, but I'm going to make sure that it stays relatively warm. So it's going to be relatively warm compared to the surface of the table, but it's going to be a cool enough color so that we can contrast it with the temperature of the orange. So I think probably something like this works.
Professor,
Yeah.
so the area that you're painting in right now is a cool tone orange?
Yeah, so it's a mixture of white, transparent red oxide, and black. So I've cooled that orange down. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
And I might need to cool that down more. So I know at the beginning of the semester I said that we should always block in with just one tone for each area. And in general, I think in general, I stand by that advice. But I will indicate some variation in these large areas of value. So I'm going to, right at the start, show the way the back wall of the box becomes a little bit darker as it moves further away from the light source. You can certainly indicate those major shifts in light. I'm not going to be looking at details, but I think it's worth indicating that shift. Okay, so I think we have a decent approximation of the temperature differences between the tabletop and the back wall. So now, keeping with our approach of painting lights and shadows, so keeping with the way we approach painting form through light and shadow by identifying separate shapes of light and separate shapes of dark, I'm going to block in the cast shadow on the surface of the table that's being created by the orange. So now, again, on the reference I sent you today, the cast shadow looks cold. It looks dark and very cold. But this is a very warm cast shadow. And again, it's warm because of that really important property of light and shadow, which is that it's picking up light. The light's not hitting this area of the tabletop, but light is bouncing off areas around it, specifically the walls of the box, and it's bouncing back into this shadow area. So this isn't getting direct light, but it's getting considerable amounts of reflected light. So this shadow has this cast shadow has a pronounced and significant undertone, warm undertone. And I want to just, again, emphasize this. I've already said it several times over the semester, but today again. But I really want to emphasize this important aspect of painting lights and shadows, because in the critiques last week, this came up as a challenge for some people, or a challenge for some people was getting the really dark values in the painting. And the primary reason people were having that challenge, having that difficulty, was because people were not painting the light and shadow masses as separate areas. Instead, people were putting down a big kind of fill-in color or fill-in value of light, and then trying to paint the shadow into that. But that just does not work with oil paint, because there's so much wet paint on the surface that wet paint is going to continue to interfere with that dark that you're trying to create, that dark shadow you're trying to create by painting dark paint into light. And that doesn't work when creating lights and shadows. You can certainly paint wet into wet in certain instances, and that's a very useful technique. But wet into wet does not work for painting shadows. You have to paint lights and shadows as separate areas. And you won't be able to get convincing value relationships until you do that. So I'm painting the cast shadow and just indicating here shadow accents, or what we've often called forgetting what we called it. What do we call that? We call that the occlusion shadow. And so then, as I've mentioned many times, we've painted our mass of light and shadow, but we don't want to leave this sharp edge, right? So I'm going to bring in the color of the halftone. I'm going to stitch that in, and that halftone is a kind of cooler. It's a cooler tone. It's cooler than the bulk of cast shadow. Bring in that halftone. Now, in all honesty, I might have gone a little bit, I might have overstated the warmth of the cast shadow. I don't mind that. I'll be honest, I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to overstate it quite like I did. But I don't mind that. I don't mind erring on the side of warmth when we're dealing with warm shadows. I think that gives the painting, well, on the one hand, very simplistically, it gives the painting a kind of warmth. But it really creates a convincing appearance of a shadow. The shadows, I think we often think of them as not having light on them so that they're cool. But shadows are very often warm. And I don't mind emphasizing that aspect of them. I will eventually cool that down, I'll be honest. But I'm gonna leave it for now. Okay, so again, going on the same method we've been talking about all semester. So I'm now going to block in the shadow mass on the orange. The shadow mass on the orange, it's about the same temperature as the shadow, the cast shadow. No, I'm wrong about that. It's a little bit warmer. So that's actually going to possibly make it necessary for me to cool down the cast shadow. So I'm taking my transparent red oxide and using that as a base for the shadow. I'm going to cool it down a little bit with some ivory black. I'll add some white to it. Too dark. Add a little bit more transparent red oxide. A little bit of white. Okay, so now I'm going to compare this value. This value to me looks very, it looks very dark. But remember, we've talked about colors when you're first blocking in a painting looking dark because we have so much white still on the canvas. So before I make a decision, I'm first going to block in this color I have and see how that value compares to the values around it. So the value of that shadow mass I'm putting down on the orange needs to be several steps darker than the value of the surface of the box right behind it. And I think this value relationship is about right. That's about the value relationship that I'm looking at. So even though that value looked too dark when I first put it down, now when I now compare it to the other values that are up there on the painting, I see that that value actually works. And when I compare it to also the value that I put down for the back wall, that seems like the right value to me. So I'm going to leave that. I think that's right. So I'll indicate some of the details. I'm going to put in details here, but I'm going to be thinking of them exactly the same way I thought of everything else, which is as planes of lights and shadows. So details are no different than any other part of the painting. We're only seeing those details because light is hitting an object, and those details are being revealed to us as planes of light and shadow. So now, if people look at the reference I sent, you'll notice that the shadows here on the underside of the orange. So on the side of the orange, as the planes turn under like this, or on the surface of the orange as the planes turn under, or as they turn under here. So as those planes turn under, the surface of the orange is more directly facing the reflective surface of the tabletop. So light, which is coming from this direction, like that, light's coming from here. And it's hitting the surface of the table here, and then bouncing back into the shadow side of the orange. So you're going to see in the reference photo that the shadow side of the orange down here is considerably lighter than it is here. But that is that's still a shadow side. So you'll see that part of the orange is still on the dark side of the terminal. Right? The orange has already turned away from the light source. So you want to make sure that you don't misinterpret these bright areas of reflection as parts of the light source. That's one of the most common mistakes in painting objects in light and shadow. We've talked about it before. It's the mistake of overemphasizing reflective light. You want to avoid that at all costs. So I've blocked in the entirety of the shadow mass with that one tone. And if anything, you want to keep the shadows or the reflective lights in the shadows understated. So you never want to overstate them. So you never want to make them too light. If anything, it's better to make them too dark, because that helps you create as convincing a sense of volume as possible. So I'm going to paint that reflective light, but I'm only going to paint it after I have all the values put in. And right now, I'm going to leave that underside of the orange that's getting a lot of reflective light. I'm going to leave that as part of the shadow. So I'm going to give myself more light. So I'm going to mix a very light value red using white, transparent red oxide, obviously. For the light side of that orange. Now the most important thing is to suggest the temperature and the value. So I'm putting that down. So remember, we're not going to get that color. What do people think of that for the value of the light side of the orange? Does that need to get lighter, or is that about right? Does it need to get darker? So compare that to the values in the reference photograph. So how should that change, if it should change at all?
I think it could be a little bit lighter.
It could be a little bit lighter, for sure.
Mhm.
Now this is something you want to resist an urge that a lot of people have. When painting, again, when painting with this limited palette, you just can't get these colors. So you're going to find that if you end up painting an orange for this assignment, you're going to find that the color appears to be closer to the color of an orange when there's more red in it. But if there's more red in it, it's going to be darker. And you want to suggest the value difference, but you also want to suggest, you want to suggest the temperature difference, but you also want to suggest the value difference. So we have to find a kind of happy medium. So I'm going to put in a very light color because I want to strongly suggest that value difference. Now, remember, this is obviously not the color of an orange. It's sort of in the family of the color of an orange. But it's not that orange we're looking at right now, and we're not going to be able to make it that. So just remember, we're not trying to match color. We're just trying to suggest variations of warm and cool and value distinctions. So I'm going to block in very broadly. That light side of orange. And again, I'm working very simply, just finding an overall light mass and an overall dark mass. I am going to block that back a bit. I'm going to actually put a third tone in here. So what I just did there was I had too much paint on, so I just scraped some of it off. It's too much paint because that would interfere with other tones I want to make wet into red. So I'm going to add to these tones. I'm going to add a transitional light tone. So I'm going to add a slightly darker light tone that takes into account some of the planes on the light side of that orange that are just slightly turned away from the light source. So as the orange moves, it rolls around its face and moves towards the terminator where it turns completely away from the light source. We're getting a slightly darker half tone, and I want to indicate that. I'm still working lights and shadows, but I'm careful to note that the lights are not absolutely uniform. And I think it's going to be helpful for us to indicate some of these transitional sort of half tones. Here's where we're picking up on what we learned last week about planes. Right? So these half tones are parts of the orange that are turned, just turning away from, they're starting to turn away from the light source. I'm very careful about their value, but I think that's a useful secondary tone. So that transitional halftone plane, something like this. So I actually made a little bit of a mistake here in drawing this painting. So transparent red oxide is a very strong color. In other words, it has what they call a lot of tinting strength. So as you paint more, you'll find that some colors, with some colors, it's hard to change other colors. But certain colors, all you need is a tiny bit of it, and it really strongly changes any color you add it to. So transparent red oxide has very strong tinting strength. Actually, it was not a good idea for me to do the drawing using transparent red oxide, because it's going to be hard to get rid of that line. I want to get rid of that so we're not looking at a line around the painting. I mean, a line around the object. So that's maybe a little better for now. Okay, so I'm going to continue a bit with that halftone. I think that the top plane of that orange has that same halftone. So remember, we talked about this a little bit, but when we're painting our objects, we always want to look for the entirety of the planar structure. So this orange has top plane to it. In other words, there's a kind of surface up there that you could rest an object on, a small object. You always want to be conscious of indicating the totality of the planar structure. Because if we don't indicate this top plane, we're going to have a piece of fruit that appears to be flat. So we want to indicate the way the light rates across that top plane for meeting the shadows. So now I'm going to look at, now I'm going to have the lights and dark masses in. I'm going to look at that really important element of light and shadow that I want people to not forget about. This is also something that, for some reason, people sometimes forget about. This may be my fault in the way I emphasize lights and darks. So I want people to make sure that when we're dealing with these lights and darks, mass in the lights and mass in the darks, and then you go back in and you find that really important transitional halftone. Because you don't want that division between light and shadow to be that sharp edge. Right? That the transition from light to shadow is always a soft transition. Right? There's a clarity of light and shadow. You can see the distinction between light and shadow. It is certainly not a completely even gradation, like a Photoshop gradation, something like that. But it, nevertheless, the division between light and shadow has this kind of softness. You want to go in and find that halftone. That's as important as the light and the dark masses. And that's what's ultimately going to give the object you're painting, particularly organic objects, it's going to give it that sense of three-dimensional believability. It's going to give it that sense of organic naturalness. So I had those two areas blocked very clearly. Now I'm just nudging that edge with the halftone. And whatever technique, there are multiple techniques for doing this. I have a certain way of putting it down. Whatever technique you find that works is completely acceptable. But some people paint in a way that more emphasizes the physicality of the paint, and that's completely fine. So I mentioned that these details are as much planes of light and shadow as anything else. And because that's true, these also have halftones. As those turn from their light sides into their dark sides. That those probably need to be a little bit lighter in value. Let me go with my dry brush and start to merge some of those tones. So I'm always blending right at that meeting point between the light and the dark. I'm not over blending, I'm not doing anything like that. Just making that transition relatively soft and hopefully organic looking. I'll look for areas along the shadow edge that are relatively soft and some areas that are relatively hard, that division. go in now and indicate a highlight. So the highlight on this is very diffuse. So it's not a sharp highlight. Part of that diffusion is pores on the skin of the orange. Okay, so we mentioned a few minutes ago, or a while ago, we mentioned how bright, how intense the reflected light gets down here. And it's lighter than the shadow here. It's also, is it cooler? That's tough. It's actually ever so slightly cooler because it's picking up some of the reflection of the blue, or some of the color of the blue. So I am going to go in there and just lighten this slightly. Ever so slightly. Yeah, I was a little worried about that temperature, but I think that's right. It needs to be a little bit cooler than most of the shadow side. All right, so let's see, what time is it? 10. So I think that, so I talked about these details as being light and dark, planes of light and shadow, which they are. But I do think they need to get a little bit lighter. So we go in, a little bit of a lighter value. Now work these against each other. Work the light into the shadows. So in doing these details here, felt like the value I put down at first for those small planes of shadow was too dark. So I'm in a way right now messing it all up. I'm taking a dry brush, blending the lighter paint around it right into those shadow planes. Sort of lighten those shadow planes. You can certainly do that. So right away, I think some of it will look better. And then I'm going to now I'm going to take my light color, my very light value, the orange. I'll go back in and redefine some of those shapes. Maybe that a little bit. Just a little bit, what am I trying to say? They got a little bit too messed up. So using the light to carve back in those now lighter shadow planes to get the shape a little bit more accurate again. I'm in a way right now just reblocking in planes of light around those planes of shadow. Just constantly thinking of these areas of light and dark planes. Now I'll just blend that edge between the light plane and the shadow plane. That detail. So the little remains of the stem of the orange, it's mostly visible to us because it's a bit of light hitting off the planes of the stub that are still remain. So one last thing I want to talk about, we're not going to go a full session today. I'll break and people can use the time to get started on your setup. But I do just want to emphasize those major elements of light and shadow we talked about. So there's a very subtle, and I'll leave this one out, there's a subtle core of the shadow. It's orange, it's just it's a slightly cooler band, cooler and darker band of the shadow. It's most visible at the top. It starts to disappear a little bit as we get down towards the reflecting or the surfaces of the orange that are receiving reflected light. But it still disappears a little bit, but it's still visible. So we don't want to ignore it. So remember, you always want to be dealing with light and shadow, dealing with the creation of form by finding those elements of light and shadow that we've talked about since day one. So not only the light mass and the dark mass, but the reflected lights, the halftones, core of the shadow. You want to find all of those elements of light and shadow in the objects we're painting. Okay, so I'm going to end, I'm not going to carry the demo live in class as far as I do some of them. I'm going to leave it here. Hopefully the main objective is clear, that we're looking for, not looking to match color, but we're looking for these distinctions between cool and warm, right? warm, cool. You want to be looking for those distinctions in this palette. So, so the assignment for next week will be to the assignment for next week will be to set up your own still life. It should be a piece of fruit, a simple piece of fruit or a simple vegetable, as we've talked about in the past. Lit with a raking light source, as we always do, and make a painting of that object using white, black, and your transparent red oxide. Okay. I am going to add one thing to the assignment, or one requirement. So, and please pay attention to this, because this is going to be, again, it's going to be required, and I won't accept an assignment without this. So when you submit your assignment, you need to submit to me your painting, and you need to submit to me a photograph of the object you worked from, okay? So you have to submit both, a photograph of your painting and then a photograph of the object you worked from. Okay, both of those will be required. And I want to emphasize something I did say on the syllabus. If people remember at the beginning of the semester, I made clear that the assignments you do need to be paintings that you make from a setup that you yourself create. So you need to have all of those supplies that I mentioned at the beginning of the semester. So in addition to all your painting supplies, you need to have a box, you need to have a light where you can set up those elements, okay? So you need to send me, again, a photograph of the painting you do and a photograph of the setup that you worked from, so I can see both of those. I'll send that in an email. But does anyone have any questions about that? No. Okay, so if there aren't any more questions, I'm going to end the session today. Give people a chance to start setting up for the assignment. If anyone does have any questions, you can always email me. But no questions from anybody?
Professor,
Yes.
for the last assignment, I didn't see a grade for it on
I'm sorry.
Blackboard.
I haven't graded them yet, but I'll do that tonight. I apologize.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Anybody else?
Yeah, can we use an apple?
Yeah, you can use an apple. You just want to be careful of, you don't want to get thrown off by the various colors on the surface.
Yeah, okay.
Right? So you still want to see the clear light and shadow on it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you have a red apple and there's a lighter area on the apple, you want to make clear in the painting that lighter area is a change in the color of the skin and not a change that's the result of light.
Okay.
Okay? Okay, so again, if there are no other questions, I'll end the session for today, and just email me with any questions you have. Okay, have a good week, everybody.
Have a good weekend.
You too. Take care.
Thank you.